Preliminary thought as to your own views on the extent to which the issues of privacy and security, are they a choice or are they just different sides of the same coin? How would you tend to assess your view on how this committee should look at these matters? Who would care to begin? Yes, please.
Step forward as a philosopher, I suppose. So there is a view around that these are, in some sense, two sides of the same coin. And I'm less persuaded about that myself. It seems very clear to me that there is a trade-off. So there are certain practices which would be beneficial for security and which are adverse to citizens' privacy. And the question that really confronts the committee and indeed the nation is whether indeed that is a trade-off that we should accept. So it seems no doubt to me that there is a balancing act that has to be performed here, and that's a really substantial issue.
It's interesting because many of our civil liberties witnesses have argued against that. You take a very different view. What about your colleagues? Would they care to offer a similarly succinct opinion on this matter?
If I might
please
take it. I think that in terms of thinking about security and privacy, one of the mistakes our public discourse is making is in treating both concepts as if they were, as it were, unitary and straightforward. Security, for example, is a function of two things. It's a function of the level of harm that we might be considering and the probability that that harm will happen. And in dealing with it, the question that we have to address as societies is how do we strike a balance between the risk of harm and the risk to society by overreacting. And that, in my opinion, that judgment currently is made, as it were, in private or in secret, and ought to be made in some more public and accountable ways. On the privacy front, likewise, privacy is not a unitary concept. It's very important for liberty. It is, in fact, for this society mandated by the European Convention on Human Rights. It is culturally determined. It's valuable for individuals, and it's also valuable for society. And it's also domain dependent. So we have different expectations of privacy depending on the settings in which we are. I would have no expectation of privacy, for example, at Speaker's Corner. I would have less expectation of privacy on the street, on a public pavement. And I have very high expectations of privacy within my own home. So these two concepts are actually very complicated, in my opinion. And I think that the rather glib juxtaposition of the two, which says it's one or the other and there's a balance to be struck between them, that's not quite right. It's a balance between two very complicated things.
Thank you. Hazel.
Yeah, just to follow that up a little bit, we had some evidence yesterday that this in fact wasn't a balance and not a trade-off, and that what there is under the ECHR is a right to privacy for family life, and that then in the national security construct, that right is then constrained by the authorities and the legislative framework, whether that's RIPA or whatever else, that it enables you to intrude on that privacy. So that's another different concept, rather than it being a trade-off and rather than putting them together. And I thought that was quite an attractive proposition. In terms of the ECHR, presumably you would accept that there are circumstances in which, if you like, the collective safety of the nation is put before the individual's right to privacy, subject to a legal regime.
Yeah. Dr. Richards, would you like to respond?
Yes, I would absolutely accept that, and I think that's right. And I think that's the framework we have in place, whereby the Human Rights Act is the act that we've put in place to cover those ECHR provisions. I personally think that's obviously the devil is in the application of proportionality and necessity, both of which are not necessarily clearly definable terms, but the basic principles of those are understood and are correct in my view. And the oversight and administrative processes, so that you have that regime, and the key is that you operate it in appropriate ways in terms of oversight and accountability. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that's the right regime, and I think that's the right way to do it.
Do we assume that if there is some element of trade-off, the more the threat, I mean, we are living through a period of real terrorist threat. We haven't always had that. We may not have it in future. Is it being argued that if the threat is greater, then the diminution of privacy may be something that a free society has to accept?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think what is changing, there are some very fundamental changes happening at the moment to both the nature of the threat in terms of the networked nature of it, which has certain implications for how we tackle that threat, and also the general definition of privacy in an internet age. I mean, clearly those things are changing. I don't think that should or should mean a diminution of an expectation of privacy. I think it's just the nature of how that plays out in practical terms is changing with the technology that's changing.
Ming Campbell?
Illustration I used yesterday, which is a member of my family meets girlfriends by using the internet. And I occasionally, from time to time, go to a supermarket. We know that, first of all, he will have given up a great deal of private information for the purpose of meeting someone. And when I go into the supermarket, I know that the kind of things I buy and how often I buy them will, as it were, be taken to form a profile of me as a customer. How far does anything that any of you have said be altered by the fact that there's a kind of voluntarism about privacy, which perhaps we did not imagine certainly 20 years ago, and perhaps not as recently as 10 years ago?
Might I address that? Because I think that goes right to the heart of this debate, because we've got a long-standing moral consensus that government should not be, as standard, surveilling citizens' lives unless there's reasonable suspicion of criminality. And this is the central claim, that we've got a change in understanding of privacy, and this justifies a change in that practice now. But I think I'm in very strong disagreement with that. And the reason is the voluntarism with which we've disclosed detail about ourselves to dating websites or to supermarkets is that we have done so voluntarily, and it's a fundamentally different relation in the marketplace as it is in relation to the state, because the state does so coercively without anyone's right to recourse. The moment you've ticked the end-user license agreement button, you've signed away your moral right. Now, there's a separate question as to whether that should be regulated, whether that meets the conditions for informed consent, but that's a separate question. But the fundamental point is that government, the bulk data collection practices that have been revealed have been happening without citizens' consent. And there's actually a deeper consideration here as well. So the question is, one question is, what does the youth of today think should be private and not? And it may well be that the youth of today have a different understanding to what an older generation does. Another question is, what do we want as a society to have as an understanding of privacy in 50 years or 100 years' time? And the crucial opportunity that we have here is, in setting the legislation, we send a signal to society about what we think would be beneficial for it to be considered private and what to be public. So there's a shaping influence that legislation has on society's expectations in the long term. And therefore there's an expectation setting process that's happening now. And so insofar as we decide collectively that we should not be surveilling these kind of as standard citizens' private practices, we send the expectation that this indeed should be private. Just to conclude on the point, there's a really helpful historical analogy here. During the Civil War, the post was routinely surveilled by the Roundheads, and as part of the Spymaster General's intelligence campaign. There was a military justification for that at the time. But 30 years later, there'd been a decision that letters should not be public. They should not be something that government has routine access to. And in some sense, it could have gone either way. So government could have said letters are public in the same way that postcards are public. But we'd have been living with that 400 years down the line of a form of communication which would not be possible to open ourselves up to other people on an intimate basis because of. And there's a similar question here as to what the future is for online forms of communication, whether they're ones that we want to preserve as a society, as ones which can be private and outside of government interference.
But isn't your illustration precisely the point made by the chairman? Because there was peace, would it have been much easier to decide, well, we're not going to open people's letters? I mean, for example, in both the First World War and the Second World War, very restrictive legislation was passed.
Right.
When the wars were over, at least after the Second World War, that legislation was repealed. Why? Because we were in a peaceful situation, peaceful circumstances. So how far does the prevailing sense of the nation dictate the extent to which privacy takes precedence, if you like? Oh, it's rather crudely put, I hope you'll do it. Takes precedence over security, or vice versa.
Mr. Gill, would you like to offer a view?
Just on that, I mean, it's a good question. The big shift, I think, is that we've since the end of the Cold War, and we thought there was going to be a peace dividend and so on. What we've seen instead, and I think it's been largely technologically driven, although this is really John's area rather than mine, is that it's not that it's changed the desire of states to collect everything if they can. What it has changed dramatically is the potential to do it. I mean, despite Tom's example, I mean, my understanding of internal security for the last 200 or 300 years is that the post has been regularly intercepted, always. And then it was telegrams, and then it was radio, then it was telephones and so on. The state has always had this desire to do that, but it always had to be selective, because otherwise it was completely, impossible task. What has transformed the ability is obviously the digital age, so that now it raises the possibility of literally collecting everything. And as we know, both our own agencies and in the United States, particularly building facilities in Utah, with the explicit aim of collecting and storing everything. And of course, one has a distinct sense this is completely lacking any proportionality to the threat. We don't face the threat now that we faced in the Second World War. We are not now to be, about to be invaded by a ruthless foreign state and a large army and secret police to go. We face a threat, yes, but it's nothing like the threat we faced in the Second World War. But
we can argue about the nature of the threat. Actually, an internal threat might be, in some ways, a bigger problem. I wanted to go actually back, because I think it's an interesting theme that Professor Simpson had about the idea of the youth of today, and the way he put it. Does he think, I mean, the concern actually is, given how relatively recent the internet is, that we put into place now some sort of firm template that actually in years ahead will seem very dated as well. Dare I say it, the youth of today will themselves grow up. It's often said that libertarians are people who haven't had children. The moment you have children, you have a rather different view on the liberty of drugs and the like going forward. And the youth of today will get older, and they may actually have attitudes quite similar to people in their 40s and 50s about issues of privacy, in a way that they're much more freewheeling at the moment. And isn't this a concern, that actually we look at things in this excitement of the internet generation, but without recognising that not only will the internet itself change, but actually a lot of the attitudes that we think we should be perhaps pandering to for young people who know that and only know that as the way of communicating will themselves also alter as time goes by.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose there's So there's two issues. So one is clearly legislation has to be responsive to the changing needs, and the needs of 20 years will be different to the needs of today. I think, and that's clearly, I'm sure no one disagrees with that. I think the related issue here is that where boundaries of privacy are set, it's going to be it's easier to allow something to become public than to then recreate it as private. Once the genie's out the bottle, it's something that we've got very little ability to put back in the bottle in that sense. And so insofar as we think at least people who are young now might want in the future to have the benefit of a more capacious sense of what's private as against what's public, then there's a responsibility there not to be too quick to rush into saying actually everything is public and therefore we can do what we want with the data that's out there.
A final question in this section, Robin Butler.
But isn't, leave aside voluntarism, isn't there real evidence that the public attitude to privacy has changed? I mean, I remember 25 years ago, a congestion charge was unacceptable because of the photographing of number plates. It was unacceptable for social security records to be shared with the Inland Revenue. People have come to accept closed-circuit television cameras. Isn't there actually a lot of evidence that the whole attitude of our society to privacy has changed and has become more relaxed?
Right. Yeah. So there is that, and then the question is it a good thing or not? And the danger is that we sleepwalk into a situation where we steadily give up more and more parts of our lives and allow state intrusion into that. And before we know it, we've come to a point which none of us thought would happen, but yet it's become standard practice. And
Is it necessarily sleepwalking, though? Maybe it's a practical, pragmatic judgment that the benefits of CCTV cameras far outweigh the intrusion of privacy. Is that necessarily to be seen as a form of sleepwalking?
Right, yeah, so it's not necessarily sleepwalking, but in some sense what we've had here in the moment in the last 18 months or so with the Snowden revelations is a forcing into the public discussion these issues. Now, the related thing is there may well be factors specific to Britain which mean that the British public is less sceptical, doesn't react quite so strongly to the kinds of data collection practices that Lord Butler's identified. In part because we have very significant trust in our institutions, and so there's a kind of gentle handing over of information power to the public bodies. The worry then becomes what without the appropriate safeguards, without the appropriate self-constraint of public bodies, what does that open us up to in the future?
Isn't there also, though, a separate question of what degree of consent there may have been, either by public or by Parliament, to what is alleged to have been the increase in powers through use of modern technology by agencies and by government?
Right, yeah. So surely the point of this is to register that there's a significant lack of consent to that handover, and so that seems to be quite significant.
Okay.
Sorry,
please.
I don't think one should take passive acceptance of fait accompli as being proof of public enthusiasm. I mean, for example, in the case of CCTV in the United Kingdom, foreign visitors are always astonished by the fact that there are all these cameras, and the British citizens seem to be quite relaxed about it. Well, part of the explanation for that might be that if you think about it from the point of view of a citizen, most of the time we are dealing in these circumstances with essentially fait accompli. Suddenly, cameras appear somewhere. Nobody voted for them. Nobody was consulted about them. They simply appeared. And it goes on, it builds. So you get a kind of disjointed incrementalism, which I think is one of our real problems in this. And one of the questions we need to ask, and I would welcome, I hope the committee does look at it, is what's the direction of travel here? Where are we going to be if we go on like this? And one possible answer is that we might wind up, for example, like a state like Singapore on steroids. Terribly, with essentially passive population which is extensively surveilled, governments which know better than anybody else what's good for people, and so on. This is one possible direction of travel for the disjointed incrementalism we have, where we have one security panic after another, which leads to a perceived need for more surveillance, and so it goes. Somewhere along the line, this has a destination, and one of the problems with our current discussion about it, in my opinion, is that we don't talk about the possible destinations enough.
Okay, this takes us very nicely into our next section of questioning, which is on the current capabilities of our intelligence agencies, and we start with the question of what's known as targeted intrusion. Julian.
Yes, we're definitely going to be coming back shortly to the key issue of bulk data, but that's not what I'm going to ask about now. There's been quite a lot of consensus on the question of the propriety or otherwise of surveillance of a specific individual, but for the sake of completeness we want to run these questions past all the witnesses that we're seeing. So where there is specific intelligence which gives reasonable grounds to believe that an individual poses a direct threat to the country, do you all consider that it is proportionate for the agencies to investigate that individual and for the investigation to intrude on that individual's privacy if it's necessary to find out what he or she is up to?
Yes, provided we have confidence in the integrity of the officials of the state who are doing that. And in the case of recent history in Britain, we have some questions to answer in these areas.
Does anyone dissent? Yes?
No, I don't want to dissent. I want to agree with the general proposition. But I just want to raise one issue I think that the committee needs to be concerned about. That in the era of big data, one of the consequences for targeting is that it's moved away from simply the targeting of identifiable individuals. In the context of the agencies not being sure precisely who or where is doing what, there is a tendency to develop profiles. And we've already talked about profiles in a rather more mundane context of shopping, but here we're talking rather more significantly in the security context. And what profiling formally is supposed to do, obviously, is to identify groups in the population whose behaviour suggests they may well need further surveillance. My observation here is that we need to be very careful of this, because while it sounds okay in theory, in practice, in the studies that have been done, it often comes down to forms of ethnic or racial profiling.
Yes, and you get what are called false positives. But
and you get that as well.
I assure you, this point has been made very strongly to us, and indeed in some of the papers that you yourselves have submitted. But at the moment, we are just simply talking, if only to eliminate it from the rest of the discussion, about the traditional idea. This is a specific individual. We have reasonable grounds for suspecting this person may be up to no good, and therefore, is it permissible, for example, to intercept that person's communications, to follow that person, or to eavesdrop on them? And I take it that there is no sort of dissent from that, providing it is done with the normal lawful authorizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we've looked at the sort of activities that where there is potential to intercept, whether eavesdropping, looking at the communications. Do you believe there are any activities that you do not believe can be justified in the circumstances, obviously, of an issue where the intelligence community feels that someone poses a direct and immediate threat? With the more traditional means of with steaming letters open or tapping telephones, now with the internet having such a big potential, the way that you referred to, Dr. Gill, do you now think that there are areas where that there should be a hard and fast line drawn on this, or can you see that there would be circumstances with all the safeguards that we're going to come on to later on, legislative and other safeguards, where we can justify?
Well, I'm happy to let the colleagues here deal with it. They're better on this than I am. But I mean, my feeling is that I can't imagine why, I can't believe any government anywhere would say there is a particular form of communication we will never, under any circumstances, seek to intercept.
Yes. Can I add to that? That I think the same principles should apply as have always applied. So a government has to deliver security on those threats that it considers to be the gravest threats to the national security. And in days gone by, that would have meant intercepting letters, steaming open letters. The government has to intercept whichever communications that those posing the threat are undertaking. So now that unfortunately means looking at emails and so on. And it would be foolish for us as a government not to be having the fullest range of capabilities on those, specifically on the gravest of threats. And there is implicit in this discussion about, which activities should we consider appropriate for interception and so on. I personally take the view that those should be restricted to the gravest matters of national security rather than some of the more public policy type issues that have come into the debate more recently.
I'm looking more just from the perspective of the mechanism. As you say, the issue about a letter is it's being sent possibly from an identifiable individual A to a certainly identifiable person B. The difficulty is, I guess, the collateral damage of if you're going through harvesting through a Facebook or another account on a particular individual. There are a hell of a lot of other people whose data is potentially put at risk as well, and therefore privacy is put at risk.
Yes.
Do you think that's just something we've kind of got to put up with, or starting, if one could, with a blank sheet of paper, could you set out a template the way you'd like to see the state constraining the justification for what it does.
Well, if I can respond on that, I mean, part of the difficulty here is a technological one, in that the mechanisms for intercepting a communication between A and B have become much more complicated than they used to be. In the good old days, you'd tap a particular phone line and you knew that was where the communication was going. The nature of global communications now is such that it's much harder to do that, which means technically you have to look in a bigger pool of communications to find the ones that you're after. So part of this is a technical issue, but also part of it is the nature of the threat. When we're looking at things like terrorist groups or organised crime groups, it's usually not the case that you're looking at one specific individual. Any particular individual of concern is usually connected to a group of other individuals who are part of a network or part of a group. So one of the things that the government has to do in delivering security on those threats is to try and work out who the other associates are. And that inevitably means we have to look at a wider range of communications.
But if I might continue on that, one of the implications of the technology and the degree of interconnectedness of individuals in an electronic world is that you obviously have to do what Dr. Richards has been saying. But if you just push that out to 2 or 3 levels, for example, everybody on Facebook has an average of 300 friends, say, and that means that if you're investigating them, then you might have to look at 300 people, and then they have 300. Soon you get to the point where a targeted investigation looks like investigating a significant proportion of the UK population. This is tricky.
No, it is.
It's part of the reality of this technology.
I accept that, and I mean, obviously, the one argument would be the absolutist argument. So it's absolutely wrong to essentially dig into this very deep pool in this sort of way. But I mean, it sounds as though you appreciate the intrinsic concerns and dilemma that our intelligence services and police have to deal with.
Sure.
But have you got any sort of solution as to how we can pacify the civil liberties element of this that is very concerned about that precise, as you say, multiplying by 3,000, 300 friends or followers at every single stage of an investigation?
I think that we have to recognise, and something that this committee is trying to grapple with, which is that this technology has arrived and it poses all kinds of existential challenges for us. And somebody once said technology is neither good nor bad, but it isn't neutral either. It changes the world with which we have to operate, and this is actually the case. None of this is easy, and I don't think any of the members of this panel think it's easy. But on the other hand, my feeling is, and I guess the feeling of some of your other witnesses has been, we are not doing very well at addressing it at the moment.
Let us now move from the relatively uncontroversial question of targeted intrusion to the slightly more controversial question of what is often called bulk collection. Michael Loeb.
What's just been said, there is a general agreement that the right to privacy is qualified by considerations of security where there are reasonable suspicions. But there is a stage before that, because if you're lucky, you might find the reasonable suspicion is there, standing up in front of you, and you can act on the basis of that. But more often than not, there is no sign of any activity which gives rise to reasonable suspicion, particularly in cases of terrorism arising from abroad and so on. And therefore, there is a preliminary stage for the security services who have to go and find out whether there are reasonable suspicions in any particular area, which will allow them then to invade privacy. And it's that area there which we've touched on a number of times, either in terms of referring to it as bulk collection or even a blanket collection, I think it was described today. But the principle is really what I'm looking for. Is there an equal principle to that relating to direct targeted invasion in terms of this wider area where you have to go out and, if you like, have a scattergun approach and see what you find?
Can I comment on that? I mean, my feeling is that you're right that this entails a wider degree of intrusion into privacy than just going after particular targets. But as I've said several times already today, actually, the nature of the threat is such that we have to do that in order to deliver security. We're looking at networked groups of individuals. We're not looking at very specific targets. So the security services, in order to get the appropriate handle on those groups and find the right targets, they have to do that target discovery process, which involves a wider degree of intrusion. Now, of course, we may be getting onto this. There's a difference between how much data you collect to give yourself the pool of data in which to search subsequently, and then how you conduct those searches. And I know a lot of the debate in this area is about is bulk collection the same as bulk analysis or surveillance of data, and I suspect that may be something we'll get onto later. But the nature of the targets and the nature of the technology, in my view, means we do have to do those sorts of things in order to deliver security.
And is there also an element of how long you held that data for? Is that important?
Yes, there is, because obviously some of that target discovery process is retrospective in a sense. You may come across a target and be needing to look back a few months to see who he or she was in contact with previously. And you can't, technologically at the moment, you can't do that unless you've kept all of that data that you then go and investigate. So, as I've said several times, there are some real technical issues here that in the future we may be able to find solutions to that allow us to be slightly more targeted and less intrusive. But at the moment, I can't really see any way round of doing those things.
I think that analysis is really helpful, because we're in danger sometimes of having a kind of polarised view of people who are saying that bulk collection is never justified in any circumstances whatsoever, because it's an intrusion on people's privacy, even though it's not being analysed. The very act of collection is the intrusion. To people who say we could use bulk collection for all kinds of things, and we should do it just because we can. And there's a danger that we get polarised. And I think the idea that technology might allow us to still create a pool of information, but a more targeted pool of information, I think is quite attractive. I don't know as yet that anybody has drawn how that might happen in practice, but I think it's quite an attractive proposition about trying to get to a better state there. I think this is really addressed to Professor Naughton and Professor Simpson, and I think in your submissions you actually take the view that a bulk collection is useful, but it shouldn't be used for predictive analysis of people who might prove to be a threat, a bit like Minority Report and all of those scenarios, and that you say that government should forgo the opportunity to use bulk metadata for predictive threat investigations. You accept this is a loss, but feel it's necessary to preserve the character of a free and open society. I would be quite interested. That seems to me to be quite close to the absolutist position that says, yes, you can do it, but you shouldn't do it in any circumstances. If there were evidence that bulk collection and then targeted analysis was providing targets that meant that we could prevent plots and protect people's security, would you still take the view, if there were that evidence, would you still take the view that you shouldn't do it?
Right, good. So I was about to jump in on Dr. Richards' evidence and respectfully disagree, if I may. So the original question was, is there a basic principle at play here? It seems to me there is a basic principle which has been a settled convention in our society, that we don't, as standard, have surveillance by both police and security services of UK citizens. So we need a reason to depart from that convention, because that.
Could I just ask you there? Do you think surveillance is collection or analysis of information?
Well, it's both, surely.
Well, I'm asking you.
So it's both. So so you could have collection which just goes into a vault and just disappears, and that's no one never ever sees the light of day. But the point of doing the practice is so that it actually can come out and see the light of day. And this is where the false positives question comes in. That there will be significant amounts of data that are looked at in relation to individuals.
So could you just clarify that point, though, because what is often indicated is that when you have material that's been collected in bulk, it is then processed through a computer, which only intercepts that bit of it which corresponds to the selectors that have been programmed. Now, the rest of it, which we're told is a very high proportion of the total, is never seen by a human eye. Against that background, in your view, does that still constitute, I don't just mean technical breach of privacy, but is it in any way a substantive breach of the privacy of the citizen, if no human eye ever sees it?
Sure. So the issue is the fringe between from a security perspective, there's two things that you've got to worry about. One is picking up people who the indicator says that there's reasons for suspicion about them, but they're not. And then the more worrying thing is missing people who are intent on doing something, but the system fails to flag them up. So from a security perspective, that's what we're worried about. From a liberty perspective, it's the former that we're worried about. So there's always going to be a drive from a security perspective to increase the penumbra of people who the system indicates there's reasons for suspicion for, but in fact there's not, and it requires a person to investigate each of those cases to decide whether there's further investigation required or whether it's a false position.
Forgive me, that's a very good analysis, but I'm not getting an answer to the question I asked, which was, in your personal judgment, if it is merely material that is processed through a computer, so far as the 98% or whatever it is that does not meet any of the selectors and which is never seen by any human eye, in your view, does that, notwithstanding that, still constitute a substantial or significant intrusion on a person's privacy?
Right. So I think it does, and I think the reason for it is the chilling effect, that the possibility of the emergence of it into the light of the day then has a chilling effect backwards on the activities in question.
Is there evidence that it has that chilling effect, or just do you believe it must do?
Right. So there's not quantitative evidence that we can point to, but in some sense, what we're looking here is the settled judgment of our history as to what things do constitute chilling effects.
Yes, Professor
Following
Naughton.
that up, two things. First of all, about the chilling effect. Well, we do have evidence that people's behaviour changes when they're being watched, and that's very old. Now, whether or not they feel the same in relation to bulk surveillance is at the moment empirically, I would say, unknown. We don't know. But I just wanted to take on what I infer to be your view about this, which is that if it's collected by a computer, well, until it's looked at by a human being, then actually it's neither here nor there. Many people in the world use webmail services like Gmail, the email service provided by Google, and that's free. You don't have to pay for it. What happens, in fact, is that Google reads your mail, and in the process, it does so in order to decide what advertisements to display next to your email. Now, when you challenge Google about that, they say, "Of course, dear boy, we don't read your mail. Our machines read your mail." And I say, okay, well, that's fine. But actually, isn't it interesting that this machine can read my email and make intelligent judgments about what I might be interested in buying, say? And in that sense, Google uses exactly the same technology as GCHQ and the NSA and other security agencies. It's the same kit.
But forgive me, when that happens in the way you've described, 99% of it is not being discarded. All of it is being used to determine which advertisements would be most appropriate to that kind of message.
But they do that for everyone. And the point I was really trying to make is that the fact that we have oceans of this stuff being collected, and it could not be looked at physically by any human being, of course. But that doesn't mean, given the capabilities of for example, modern capabilities of machine learning, of pattern recognition and so on, that you could not monitor the whole stream all the time. And we suspect that in some of the security agency cases, that's what they're doing. And it is true that human beings are not looking at it yet, but it's also the case that they have to be able to extract patterns from it, because otherwise they wouldn't know who to target.
Julian Richards?
I just want to take you back to one of Hazel's questions that we got diverted from, and that was the key question, and we have had, after some pressure, it must be said, and manoeuvring out of previous witnesses, we have had a straight answer to this question, and that is, if it could be shown that the agency's use of bulk data genuinely did achieve the discovery of a significant number of leads, and as a result of that a significant number of dangerous plots were disrupted, would you still, if you could be convinced that that was actually happening, would you still take the view that the benefit of being able to stop those plots is outweighed by the loss of privacy in bulk collection, and that therefore bulk collection still should not happen?
So if I could address that directly, I think the answer is yes. And I think we're very clear on that in the submission. And it's a real challenge for our national discussion here, because there will be people who, indeed, we had the editor of The Guardian in Oxford shortly some time ago, and I put the question to him, would he have the courage to report future terror plots which were not foiled, potentially as a result of having foregone this technology, the victims of that as heroic deaths for the cause of an open society, rather than automatically assuming that to be government incompetence. And that's the possibility that has to be recognised in relation to that.
Thank you for that very frank answer. Before I ask everyone else if they agree with it, could I ask you and your colleague, Professor Naughton, perhaps to expand on your alternative thesis a bit, which is that you feel that we could perhaps have the best of both worlds if companies preserved the databases rather than the government. But first of all, could you perhaps just confirm that you generally all agree with that firm answer from Professor Simpson?
Well, as an academic, you'd expect some reservations, and I have some. The answer in principle, I think, would be yes. I agree with Tom. On the other hand, the thing that is conspicuously lacking at the moment in this discussion, and one that is really, in my view, impaired it, is that we don't have any objective evidence that this bulk collection works in the sense of achieving the goals that it is said to achieve. And when the review committee appointed by the United States President looked into it, they didn't find it either. And claims by the American security authorities that they had foiled 6 plots and so on, and suddenly the number goes down and down and down and down. Okay. Now, it may well be that this stuff is really effective at doing it, but so far I have seen no credible public evidence of that. I am perfectly prepared to change my mind if such evidence is ever provided, but so far it hasn't been. And I think that's one of the big lacuna in this whole area at the moment.
Could your other two colleagues express their view on this question?
Sorry.
No, go on.
Well, first of all, I would respectfully not agree with Professor Simpson, and would say that if the methods we're using in bulk collection were shown to be substantively delivering security dividends for us, then I believe those do outweigh our expectations of privacy. At the same time, we shouldn't be glib about that and say, right, well, away you go, fill your boots. Clearly, a very rigorous administrative process of justification, necessity and proportionality, all the things we talked about, must be applied to that process. I believe it is being applied to that process, but I wouldn't agree that expectations of privacy would trump everything.